Is this some kind of joke? The words, sharp and dripping with contempt, cut through the stale air of the courtroom. They came from the elevated bench, from a man whose black robe seemed to puff out with self-importance. Judge Albright leaned forward, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose, a smirk playing on his lips as he peered down at the old man standing before him. "I'm looking at a charge of vagrancy, Mr. Franklin. Loitering in a public park. Don't you have anything better to do with your time?" Jack Franklin stood perfectly still. His clothes were worn, a faded flannel shirt and trousers that had seen better decades, but he wore them with a quiet dignity. His back, though stooped by age, was straight. His hands, weathered and scarred, were clasped calmly behind him. He did not fidget. He did not look away. His pale blue eyes, the only vibrant thing about him, were fixed on a point on the far wall as if he were looking at a distant horizon only he could see. A few titters rippled through the sparse audience in the courtroom. The prosecutor, a young man with an ambitious haircut and a cheap suit, shuffled his papers impatiently. The public defender assigned to Jack, a harried woman with a perpetually exhausted expression, had already pleaded no contest, eager to move on to the next case in a long and thankless day. This was supposed to be a simple, forgettable affair, a piece of human driftwood being swept along by the current of the justice system. Judge Albright was not content to let it be simple. He seemed to relish the opportunity to make an example of the silent old man. "The report says you were found sleeping on a bench near the war memorial." The irony. The judge chuckled. A dry, grating sound. "A man in your condition, cluttering up a monument to heroes. What do you have to say for yourself? Can you speak? Or did the cat get your tongue along with your home?" The public defender winced, placing a hand on Jack's arm. "Your Honor, my client is—" "I am speaking to your client," Albright snapped, his voice echoing slightly in the chamber. He turned his sneer back to Jack. "Well, old man, the court is waiting. Or are you too busy reminiscing about the good old days? I assure you, a night in a holding cell is a lot less comfortable than a park bench." For Jack, the scene was just another box to be in. He had been in tighter spots. He had been in places where the air tasted of cordite and fear, where the only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart. Compared to that, this was nothing. A mild inconvenience. A performance he had to endure. "Sir," the judge's voice boomed, louder this time, demanding attention. "I am holding you in contempt. Do you understand the words I am saying?" Jack's gaze finally shifted from the far wall and settled on the judge. His expression did not change. It was not defiant, nor was it subservient. It was simply observant. He was a man watching a storm pass, knowing that all he needed to do was stand his ground and it would eventually blow over. "I asked you a question," the judge pressed, his face turning a blotchy red. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed, to being the most important person in any room he occupied. The old man's placid silence was a direct affront to his authority. "Why were you sleeping in the park? Are you homeless?" "I don't have a permanent address at the moment," Jack said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the silent room. It was a gravelly, low voice, a voice that had not been used much lately. "No permanent address," the judge repeated, mocking the phrase. "A transient, a drifter. And what is your occupation, Mr. Franklin? What is it you do to contribute to the society whose parks you so freely sleep in?" "I'm retired," Jack said simply. The judge let out a short, barking laugh. "Retired from what? Panhandling?" The public defender started to object, but the judge waved her into silence. He was on a roll. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You know, I see men like you come through here every day, every single day. You're a burden on the system. You expect a handout. You expect the hard-working taxpayers of this city to provide for you while you offer nothing in return. You sit there in your worn-out clothes, a picture of apathy." The judge's eyes narrowed, catching on a small object pinned to the lapel of Jack's thin jacket. It was a tarnished piece of metal, a small, unassuming pin that had lost most of its luster. "What is that you're wearing? Some trinket you found? A prize from a cereal box?" The question hung in the air. For the first time, a flicker of something moved in Jack's eyes. It wasn't anger. It was memory. The roar was deafening, a physical force that vibrated through the floor of the helicopter. The air was a whirlwind of sand and heat, stinging his eyes, caking his lips. He was 20 years old, though he felt 1,000. The man beside him, a kid from Ohio named Miller who was always telling bad jokes, was bleeding from a gash on his forehead. Miller grinned, a flash of white teeth in a grime-covered face, and pressed a small pin into Jack's hand. It was their unit's unofficial emblem, something they'd had made in a village market. For being the last one standing, Jack, Miller had shouted over the noise of the rotors. Always the last one standing. The pin was warm and heavy in his palm. a small anchor in a world that had spun completely off its axis. The courtroom snapped back into focus. The judge was still talking, his voice a droning annoyance. A complete lack of respect for this court, for this city, for this country. In the back row of the courtroom, a young man named Alex Parrish sat scribbling notes on a legal pad. He was a law student, an intern for a downtown firm, sent to observe misdemeanor arraignments. He had been bored, watching the sad parade of human misery with a detached academic interest, but something about the old man and the judge's relentless cruelty had captured his attention. It felt wrong, not just legally dubious, but profoundly, morally wrong. He looked at the old veteran, Jack Franklin, and saw the stillness, the almost unnerving calm, and he looked at the pin. He'd seen pins like that before, in his grandfather's shadow box. They weren't official, they were something else, something personal, something earned in places people like Judge Albright couldn't even imagine. A cold certainty began to form in Alex's gut. He knew, with an instinct he couldn't explain, that a great injustice was unfolding. He watched as Judge Albright continued his tirade, his voice rising in sanctimonious indignation. Alex knew he couldn't interrupt the proceedings. He was nobody, just an intern. But he could do something. Quietly, so as not to draw attention, he stood up and slipped out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors muffled the judge's voice behind him. He walked quickly down the marble hallway, his footsteps echoing, pulling his phone from his pocket. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name. His father had been a Marine for 30 years. He knew people. Alex found the number he was looking for, a retired colonel his dad still played golf with. He prayed the man would answer. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice said, "Hampton." "Colonel Hampton, sir. It's Alex Parrish, Robert Parrish's son." "Alex, what can I do for you, son? Everything all right?" "Sir, I'm at the county courthouse. There's a situation here. There's an old man, a veteran I think, and the judge is tearing him apart. It's not right." Alex's voice was a rushed whisper. "The charge is vagrancy. He's homeless. The judge is laughing at him. That's a damn shame, Alex, but I'm not sure what I can do about a judge with a god complex." "Sir, it's his name," Alex said, remembering the bailiff calling it out at the start of the hearing. "The old man's name is Jack Franklin." The line went silent. For a long moment, Alex thought the call had dropped. He could hear faint, distant traffic through the courthouse windows. Finally, the colonel's voice returned, but it was completely different. The folksy gruffness was gone, replaced by a tone of sharp, cold urgency. "Say that name again, son." "Jack Franklin, sir." "James Franklin." But he said to call him Jack. Another pause, shorter this time, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Where did you say you were?" "County courthouse. Courtroom 3B. Judge Albright." "Okay, Alex. Listen to me very carefully," Colonel Hampton said, his voice now a low, intense command. "Go back into that courtroom. Do not let that man leave. I don't care what you have to do. Object, create a scene, fake a heart attack, keep Jack Franklin in that room. Help is on the way." The call ended. Alex stood in the empty hallway, his heart pounding. He didn't know who Jack Franklin was, but he knew that name had just lit a fuse. The phone call ended, but the shockwave it started was just beginning to travel. At a desk cluttered with military memorabilia and neatly stacked files, retired Colonel Hampton stared at his phone, his face pale. He took a deep, steadying breath and punched a number into his desk phone, one he knew by heart. It was a direct line, one that bypassed secretaries and aides. It was answered on the first ring. "Matthews." "General," Hampton said, his voice tight. "It's Hampton. I just got a call from the county courthouse." "A little outside your jurisdiction, isn't it, Colonel?" The voice on the other end was deep and authoritative, accustomed to command. "Sir, they have a man in courtroom 3B, a homeless veteran, picked up for vagrancy. The judge is making a spectacle of him." "I see." General Matthews's voice was tinged with weary frustration. It was a story he had heard too many times. "What's his name?" "That's why I'm calling, sir," Hampton said, his voice dropping. "His name is Franklin. Jack Franklin." The silence that followed was heavier than any words. He slammed a hand on his desk, not in anger but in a surge of pure adrenaline. "Colonel, what's the address of that courthouse? Who is the judge?" Hampton gave him the information. He could hear movement on the other end of the line, the sound of a chair scraping back, of muffled orders being barked to someone in the room with the general. "I'm on my way," General Matthews said, his voice a low growl of thunder. "Tell your boy to hold the line. The United States Army is coming to that courtroom." Back in courtroom 3B, Judge Albright was thoroughly enjoying the sound of his own voice. He had moved on from lecturing Jack and was now addressing the courtroom at large, using the old man as a prop for his own self-aggrandizing speech about civic duty and personal responsibility. And so, as a lesson, the judge declared, leaning forward with a theatrical flourish, a lesson in humility, and as a way for Mr. Franklin to finally contribute something to the upkeep of this fine city, I sentence him to 100 hours of community service. He paused for effect, letting his gaze sweep the room. He will report to the courthouse custodial staff every morning at 6 a.m. His duties will include cleaning the restrooms on every floor of this building. Perhaps then he will learn to respect public property. The sentence was not just a punishment, it was a calculated act of humiliation, a final twist of the knife. Albright smiled, a thin, cruel expression, and picked up his gavel. This was the moment he loved, the final definitive act of his power. He was about to bring it down with a satisfying crack when the courtroom doors at the back of the chamber swung open. They opened not with a bang but with a quiet, authoritative push. A man in a pressed Class A uniform stepped inside. On his shoulders were the silver eagles of a colonel. He did not say a word. He simply stood at the back of the room, his eyes scanning the scene. Judge Albright looked up, annoyed. "This is a court of law. You will not interrupt these proceedings." The colonel ignored him. A moment later, another man in uniform entered, then another. They filed in silently, standing at attention along the back wall. The air in the room began to change. The bored, indifferent atmosphere started to crackle with a new, unfamiliar tension. The prosecutor stopped shuffling his papers. The bailiff, who had been leaning against the wall, slowly straightened up. Then the final man walked in. He was in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered. His uniform was perfectly tailored, his chest a brilliant tapestry of colored ribbons and medals. On each shoulder sat 4 silver stars. General Matthews. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes, like chips of ice, swept past the audience, past the prosecutor, past the judge on his bench, and locked onto the old man in the faded flannel shirt. The sight of Jack Franklin, standing small and alone before the judge's bench, seemed to stop the general's heart for a second. He had last seen that man covered in mud and blood, carrying 2 wounded soldiers on his back. He had known him as a legend, a ghost, a man who had vanished from the world after doing things that other men only had nightmares about. Judge Albright, his face now a mask of confusion and outrage, banged his gavel. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? I am a presiding judge. Identify yourselves immediately." General Matthews paid him no mind. He began to walk down the central aisle, his polished boots making no sound on the worn linoleum floor. The other officers parted to let him through. Every eye in the room was fixed on him. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic, suddenly loud ticking of the clock on the wall. He walked with a purpose that was terrifying to behold. He walked directly to the defendant's table, stopping just short of Jack Franklin. He turned his back completely to the judge. Then, in the stunned silence of courtroom 3B, General Matthews snapped his arm up in the sharpest, most precise salute he had ever rendered. It was a gesture of profound respect, an acknowledgement of greatness that left no room for doubt. "Sergeant Major Franklin," his voice boomed, clear and powerful, resonating in the silent chamber. "It is an honor, sir." Jack Franklin slowly turned his head. He looked at the 4-star general saluting him, and for the first time a small, sad smile touched his lips. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "At ease, General." General Matthews held the salute for a moment longer before slowly lowering his arm. He kept his back to the judge, his attention focused solely on Jack. "We've been looking for you for a long time, Sergeant Major." "I wasn't hiding, sir," Jack said quietly. "Just living." "Living on the streets?" The general's voice was laced with pain. "After everything you've done? After everything this country owes you?" Judge Albright, his face now a mottled purple, sputtered from the bench. "What is going on here? Who is this man?" "Bailiff, remove these people from my courtroom." The bailiff took a half-step forward, then stopped, looking at the collection of high-ranking military officers and wisely thinking better of it. General Matthews finally turned, his movement slow and deliberate, to face the judge. His eyes were glacial. "You ask who this man is," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You sit on your throne of cheap wood and you dare to ask who this man is." He took a step toward the bench, and the judge instinctively recoiled. "This man is Sergeant Major Jack Franklin, and you, in your ignorance, have just committed a desecration." The general's voice rose, not in a shout, but in a crescendo of controlled power that filled every corner of the room. "This man served 34 years in the United States Army. He served in 3 wars. He was a Ranger. He was Delta Force. He is a man whose name is spoken with reverence in places you don't even know exist. He pointed a finger, not at Jack but at the small tarnished pin on his lapel. You mocked that pin. That pin is the last remnant of a special operations unit that was completely wiped out in the Hindu Kush Mountains. All of them, except for one man. The man who held the line for 3 days, alone, against an enemy force of over 200. The man who carried 6 wounded comrades to safety. The man who refused to leave until he had recovered the bodies of every one of his fallen brothers. That man is standing in your courtroom today. Gasps rippled through the audience. The young prosecutor looked like he was about to be sick. The public defender stared at her client, her mouth hanging open. This man, the general continued, his voice dropping to a raw, emotional pitch, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He was awarded the Silver Star. 3 of them, he was awarded the Bronze Star for Valor. 5 of them, he was awarded the Purple Heart. So many times they told him to stop collecting them because it was becoming a paperwork nightmare. The general paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the suffocating silence. He looked at the judge, a man who now seemed incredibly small and pathetic in his high-backed chair. "And you," General Matthews said, his voice now a blade of ice, sentenced him to clean toilets. The rebuke was complete. Judge Albright sat, stunned and silent, his face ashen. The authority had been stripped from him, leaving only a hollowed-out man in a black robe, but it was Jack Franklin who spoke next, breaking the tense silence. His voice was calm, without a trace of malice. He looked at the general, then at the judge. "The general gives me too much credit," he said simply. "I was just a soldier, doing my job." He turned his gaze to Judge Albright. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound weariness. "You don't need to see what's on a man's chest to know his worth, Your Honor. You just have to look in his eyes. Service isn't about the medals you get. It's about what you give. Some of us," he added, his gaze sweeping the courtroom, "just gave a little more than others." His words were not a condemnation, but a simple statement of fact, a quiet lesson delivered without pride or prejudice. As Jack spoke of service, a final fleeting image surfaced in his mind's eye. It was not a battlefield. It was a sterile room in a field hospital. A high-ranking officer was trying to place the Medal of Honor around his neck, but Jack was looking at the young doctor beside him, a woman with tired eyes who had just spent 48 straight hours saving the lives of his men. He saw a nurse cleaning the brow of a wounded soldier. He saw the pilot who had flown them out through a storm of enemy fire. They were all doing their jobs. They were all serving. The medal felt heavy and wrong, a piece of metal trying to quantify something that was beyond measure. His lesson to the judge came from that place, from a deep and abiding understanding that true honor is found not in accolades but in action. The aftermath was swift and decisive. An official inquiry was launched into Judge Albright's conduct. Within weeks he was formally censured by the State Judicial Review Board and suspended from the bench pending mandatory retraining, with a special focus on veterans affairs. His picture was in the local papers, his name a synonym for arrogance and ignorance. The fall from his petty throne was absolute. The vast, quiet network of the military community enveloped Jack Franklin. He was given a clean, quiet apartment, a full medical evaluation from the VA, and a pension that had somehow gotten lost in decades of bureaucracy. He asked for nothing, but received everything he needed. He was no longer on the street, no longer invisible. Several months later, a man sat alone at a small table in a quiet coffee shop, staring into a cup of black coffee. It was Albright. He was no longer a judge. He was just a man, stripped of his robes and his gavel, a man haunted by his own words. He looked up when the bell on the door chimed, and his breath caught in his throat. Jack Franklin walked in. He was wearing a simple pair of jeans and a clean work shirt. He looked different. The deep-etched lines of exhaustion on his face had softened. He ordered a coffee and, turning from the counter, saw Albright. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment, Albright considered fleeing, but he knew he couldn't. He stood up, his hands trembling slightly, and walked over to Jack's table. "Mr. Franklin," he began, his voice raspy, I don't expect you to accept it, but I wanted to say, I am sorry, truly sorry, for what I did, for what I said. There is no excuse." Jack looked up at him. His pale blue eyes were clear and steady. He studied the former judge's face for a long moment, seeing not the arrogant tyrant from the courtroom, but a broken, ashamed man. He simply nodded. "I know," he said, and with those 2 words he granted the man a grace he did not deserve. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Sit down. The coffee's good here." Albright, stunned, slowly sat down. The 2 men, once separated by a universe of power and prejudice, sat in silence for a moment, 2 ordinary citizens sharing the quiet of a Tuesday morning. The debt had been paid, the scales rebalanced, not by revenge but by a simple act of unassuming dignity. If this story of quiet courage and ultimate vindication moved you, show your support by liking this video, sharing it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribing to Veteran Valor for more stories of the heroes who walk among us.